Okay, so, like, even now, right, you think about the Manson family murders, and it's just crazy.
La Bianca murders, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so brutal, you know? It's like, you think about the 60s, the summer of love, peace and love, and then
It
this
really is a paradox, isn't it?
totally, a
Yeah.
total paradox. Like, these were supposed to be peaceful hippies,
Ah.
you know, and it all seems to come back to Charles Manson. Like, he had this hold over them. And, well, I'm sure most of you listening know the basic story, but you might not know how many other theories are out there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And today we're going to deep dive into some really fascinating stuff you sent over. It's all about this book, Chaos. Charles Manson, CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s by Tom O'Neill. And there's this documentary, too, Chaos, The Manson Murders, directed by Errol Morris. Plus some news articles and a review from Collider about the documentary.
Right. And for years and years, like, the main story everyone's heard is about Helter Skelter, right? That whole race war thing that Vincent Bugliosi, the prosecutor, laid out in the trial.
Yeah, he basically said that Manson thought the Beatles' White Album was like a prophecy about this upcoming race war. Black people rising up against white people.
Hmm.
Except Manson and his followers would be safe hiding out in the desert until it was all over.
And that the murders were supposed to, like, kickstart this whole thing. But
Exact.
what's so interesting is that Tom O'Neill's book and this documentary really dig into some alternative explanations. It's like they're saying, hold on, is that really the whole story?
Mm-hmm.
Or is there more to it?
Yeah, and the documentary and the book, they kind of walk this line.
Yeah.
They bring up these possibilities, connections to M-Cultra, which was this whole CIA mind control program. And then there's Operation CAOS, where the CIA was keeping tabs on all these counterculture movements.
Right. And that's what's so fascinating about this. It's not like they're saying, we have proof of all this. It's more like they're raising these really thought-provoking questions.
Totally. It's like, hey, what if we look at this from a totally different angle?
Yeah. So, okay, let's talk about the documentary itself. The
Yeah.
Collider review mentioned the visuals, and I have to say, I kind of agree with them.
What did you think?
Well, they said it felt very like standard true crime documentary. You know what I
Oh,
mean?
yeah, I see what they're saying. They talk about all the crime scene photos and then the pictures of the victims and the Manson family and, of course, Spahn Ranch. It's all stuff we've kind of seen before in other documentaries.
Exactly. It's not like super groundbreaking or anything visually. But then there's this whole thing with Manson's music, which I thought was really interesting. The reviewer mentions that they actually play his songs in the documentary, and they're not what you'd expect.
Not like crazy death metal or anything,
No,
right?
not at all. It's actually more like the reviewer called them hippie ballads.
Wow. So not exactly what you'd picture coming from the guy who supposedly orchestrated these murders.
Right. And there are a couple of different ways to look at this. One is that it kind of supports this theory about Manson's main target. Maybe not being Sharon Tate, but actually Terry Milcher, who was a music producer.
Oh, yeah, he used to live in the house where Sharon Tate was murdered.
Exactly. And the theory is that Manson like really wanted to be a musician, but he felt rejected by the industry, and he held a grudge against Melcher for not giving him a break.
Ah, I see.
But the reviewer also brings up this kind of disturbing point about playing Manson's music in the documentary. Like, they say it might actually humanize him in a way.
Yeah, I can see that, especially with everything else going on in the film. Like you've got this ominous soundtrack and you're hearing about all these disturbing theories and then they play Manson's music and it's not like totally horrible or anything.
The reviewer even compares it to Hitler being a painter. Like,
Right.
they were both capable of these horrific things, but they also had this artistic side.
Right. And it makes you wonder, you know, is it right to present that side of someone like Manson? Does it make it harder to condemn him for what he did?
It's a really interesting point, but it seems like Errol Morris, the director, he's not just trying to like force O'Neill's theories down our throats. The review says he actually interviews a bunch of different people connected to the case, including Vincent Bugliosi and Bobby Beausoleil, who was part of the Manson family.
Oh, wow. So he's getting perspectives from both sides.
Right. And the review even says that Morris told O'Neill that he was skeptical about the CIA connection. So it doesn't seem like he's trying to prove a conspiracy or anything. It's more like he's using these alternative theories as a way to question the official story that we've all been told.
I like that approach.
Wow.
Just being open to different possibilities.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so for anyone who needs a refresher on the helter-skelter theory, basically, Bugliosi said that Manson was obsessed with the Beatles' White Album, and he thought it was predicting this huge race war.
Right. Like he thought it was a prophecy from the Beatles themselves.
Yeah, and Bugliosi said that Manson believed black people would rise up and kill all the white people, except for Manson and his followers who would hide out in the desert until it was safe to come out.
And that Manson ordered the Tate LaBianca murders to make it look like black people were responsible.
Exactly. Like he was trying to frame the Black Panthers and start this whole race war. But here's the thing, both O'Neill and Beausoleil, they push back against this whole helter-skelter idea.
Yeah, the Entertainment Weekly article says that Beausoleil claims Bugliosi knew the helter-skelter motive was bogus.
Like he made it up.
Well, Beausoleil says Bugliosi knew it wasn't the real motive, but he used it anyway because it would make his book sell better.
Wow. And the article even mentions that Manson himself said helter-skelter just meant confusion. So it's like you've got Bugliosi's very specific interpretation of this phrase versus Manson and Beausoleil saying it wasn't that deep.
It makes you wonder, maybe the helter-skelter story has stuck around for so long because it's kind of a neat and tidy explanation for something that's actually really messy and confusing.
Yeah. Maybe we prefer a story that makes sense even if it's scary than to accept that sometimes things happen for no reason.
I think that's something we all do as humans. Yeah. We try to find patterns and meaning even when there might not be any.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the CIA connection. This is where it gets really creepy. MKUltra was this real CIA program back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and they were doing all these experiments with LSD.
Yeah, trying to figure out if they could use it for mind control or interrogation or even to create like sleeper agents.
Mm-hmm.
Seriously messed up stuff.
And it's not just LSD. They were experimenting with other drugs and hypnosis and sensory deprivation, all sorts of crazy things.
And a lot of these experiments were done on people who didn't even know they were part of it.
Right. It's like something out of a spy movie, but it was real.
Yeah.
And one article mentions that a lot of this was driven by Cold War paranoia. Like the U.S. government was terrified of the Soviets and they were willing to try anything to get an edge.
Yeah, and there's even this theory that some of the MKUltra stuff was based on research that Nazis did during World War II.
Oh, wow. That's dark.
Super dark.
Yeah.
And one of the articles mentions that the CIA got really interested in LSD after reading The Manchurian Candidate.
That book about a brainwashed assassin.
Yeah, exactly. It was like they were trying to create real-life Manchurian candidates.
Yeah.
Now, of course, no one has ever proven that they were successful.
It's unsettling to think about.
Totally. So how does Manson fit into all of this?
Well, O'Neill's theory is that Manson might have been connected to MKUltra through this place called the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic in San Francisco.
Ah, okay, I've heard of that place.
So Manson and his followers, they were hanging out there in 1967. Apparently, they were going there for treatment for STDs, which makes sense given their lifestyle.
Right.
But here's the interesting part. Manson's parole officer, Roger Smith, he also had an office at the clinic, and he would meet with Manson there regularly.
Okay, so that's a little bit of a coincidence.
Right. And that's where this guy, Dr. Louis Jolly West, comes in.
Who's that?
Well, he was a psychiatrist, and he was being funded by the CIA to do research at the clinic.
On LSD.
Yeah, he was studying the effects of LSD on young people. And apparently he called the clinic a laboratory disguised as a hippie crash pad.
Yikes. So he was basically using these unsuspecting hippies as guinea pigs.
That's what it sounds like. And O'Neill claims that West was involved in MKUltra experiments, specifically trying to implant false memories in people and induce trance states.
Whoa. Okay, so now we're getting to the really creepy stuff.
Right. So the implication is that Manson might have somehow been exposed to these experiments, or even been a subject himself. Maybe he picked up some techniques for manipulating people.
It's definitely a possibility. But to be fair, the articles do say that there's no direct proof that Manson and West ever actually met.
Right, O'Neill himself admits that. But it still makes you wonder, how did Manson gain so much control over his followers in such a short amount of time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's one that the helter-skelter theory doesn't fully answer.
Exactly. So let's talk about some other possible motives and explanations, because there are a few out there. Bobby Beausoleil, who was actually convicted for one of the murders, he has a whole different take on Manson.
Oh, really? What's his perspective?
Well, he doesn't see Manson as some kind of evil mastermind. He thinks the murders were more about Manson's paranoia and his need to control his followers.
Interesting. So what was he paranoid about?
According to Beausoleil, Manson was really scared of the Black Panthers.
Black Panthers?
Yeah, apparently Manson shot this guy, Bernard Crowe, and he thought Crowe was a Black Panther, but he wasn't.
Oh, wow. So he was just mistaken.
Yeah, and Beausoleil says that after that, Manson was terrified of retaliation from the Panthers.
Okay, but how does that tie into the murders?
Well, Beausoleil says that Manson wanted to frame the Black Panthers for the murder, so he left that political piggy message at the Hinman crime scene.
Oh, right. I remember that detail. They wrote political piggy on the wall in the victim's blood.
Yeah, and then Beausoleil says that Manson had his followers commit the Tate LaBianca murders to make them complicit in his crimes.
Whoa, so he was like tying them to him through guilt and fear.
Exactly. And Beausoleil paints this picture of Manson as being more reactive than proactive. Like he wasn't this grand planner, he was just making things up as he went along and getting more and more paranoid.
It's a very different view of Manson than what we usually hear.
Totally. And it makes you think about the role of the police and the whole parole system because there's some weird stuff there too.
Like what?
Well, Manson was arrested multiple times in 67 and 68, but his parole was never revoked. His parole officer kept saying he was doing fine.
Really? Even with all those arrests?
Yeah, it's strange. And then there's the Spahn Ranch raid, which happened like a week after the Tate LaBianca murders.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading about that.
So the police raid the ranch and they find all this stolen stuff, guns, cars, and they find underage runaways too.
So like a whole bunch of illegal activity.
Exactly. But everyone who's arrested is released after just 3 days, and Manson's parole still isn't revoked.
That doesn't make any sense.
I know, it's super fishy. And O'Neill suggests that maybe some of the people on the ranch were informants for the police.
Oh, wow. That would explain a lot.
Right. And then there's the whole thing with Susan Atkins' testimony.
She was one of the girls who was convicted.
Yeah, and she confessed to everything. But O'Neill's theory is that her cellmates were actually planted there to get her to confess.
What? Like they were working for the police?
That's what he thinks. And apparently her cellmates were career criminals, and they got a reward after Atkins confessed.
Wow. So it's like her confession might have been coerced.
And to make matters even worse, her original lawyer was replaced with one who was known for having really tight control over his clients.
So they wanted to make sure she said exactly what they needed her to say.
Yeah, it's all very suspicious.
Uh-huh.
And in the documentary, Morris actually says to O'Neill that the narrative around the Manson murders seems like it was managed very carefully.
Managed very carefully.
Hmm.
That's an interesting way to put it.
And O'Neill goes even further. He says it was managed and manipulated.
Which kind of brings us back to the whole context of the 1960s counterculture. O'Neill's argument is that the Tate LaBianca murders, regardless of Manson's actual motives, they ended up serving the interests of the U.S. government.
Oh, yeah, because they made the counterculture look bad.
Exactly.
Okay.
Like here you have these hippies who are all about peace and love, and suddenly they're murdering people.
It totally played into the hands of the people who wanted to discredit the movement.
Right. And O'Neill specifically points to these programs the FBI was running, like COINTELPRO, and then there was Operation CAOS, which was run by the CIA.
Remind me what those were all about.
Well, they were basically all about disrupting and neutralizing these anti-war and New Left movements. And that included the hippies and the Black Panthers.
So the government was actively trying to undermine these groups.
Yeah, they were using surveillance, infiltration, all sorts of tactics.
Mm.
And they saw the counterculture as a threat.
And then these horrific murders happen, and it's like the government's worst fears about the counterculture are confirmed.
It's almost like it was too perfect for them.
Yeah.
You know, this narrative of these free-loving hippies turning into violent killers, it played right into their hands.
Totally. And it probably scared a lot of people away from the counterculture, too. It's like, oh, these hippies are dangerous. They're on drugs, they're living in communes, and now they're killing people.
Right. It gave the government even more justification to crack down on these groups.
And to be clear, O'Neill isn't saying that the government orchestrated the murders or anything, but he is saying that they benefited from them.
Yeah, that the murders and the whole media frenzy around them helped to achieve the goals of these government programs.
It's a really disturbing thought.
Absolutely. Okay, so to wrap things up for you today, we've gone through a lot. We talk about the limitations of the helter-skelter theory, the possibility of a CIA connection, the alternative motives that Beausoleil suggests, and then this idea that the murders were used to demonize the entire counterculture movement.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that the helter-skelter story, it's very appealing in a way.
Oh.
Well, it gives us a reason for why these murders happened. It's a terrifying reason, but it's still a reason. It makes the world seem a little less random and scary.
But as Beausoleil says, it might just be a fantasy. A story that we tell ourselves to make sense of something that's actually really chaotic and senseless.
And maybe that's the most unsettling possibility of all. That there is no neat and tidy explanation. That sometimes things just happen and they're awful and there's no deeper meaning to it.
And the Collider Review really highlights that point.
Mm-hmm.
They say that humans have this tendency to create these comforting fantasies to explain difficult realities.
It's like we can't handle the idea of pure randomness and chaos, so we come up with these stories even if they're not true.
So now that you've heard all these different theories, do you feel closer to the truth about the Manson murders? Or do you feel more confused?
It's a tough question. It's like with each new layer of information, the story gets more complex and more ambiguous.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so fascinating, I think. It's a reminder that the official story isn't always the whole story, and that sometimes the truth is more complicated and more unsettling than we'd like it to be.
Absolutely. And if we can be misled about something as major as the Manson murders, it makes you wonder what else we're being misled about.
Right. Like, what other stories are we clinging to that might not be entirely true?
It's a good reminder to always be questioning, to never take anything at face value, and to keep searching for the truth, even if it's hard to find.
Yeah, well said. I think that's a good note to end on.
I think so too.